At first light on the 14th of April 1945, something deeply wrong was unfolding in a German-occupied Dutch city. An SS officer stood at his command post and watched his own forces retreat. Wehrmacht infantry, Gestapo agents, Waffen-SS units, all moving out in haste. No orders for withdrawal had been issued. No Allied artillery had fallen. No armored columns had been reported at the gates. Yet the evacuation was already underway, driven by fear rather than command. The night, the city had refused to make sense. Reports arrived one after another. Sustained gunfire from the northern district, then explosions from the east, then automatic weapons rattling from the south. Patrols sent to investigate failed to return. Messengers spoke of Canadians firing from rooftops, from alleys, from positions that shifted too quickly to track. The pattern suggested coordination. The volume suggested numbers. To German officers listening in the darkness, it sounded like the opening phase of a full-scale assault. The most alarming signal came when the Gestapo headquarters erupted in flames. The building burned fiercely, its fire visible across the city. To German command, this was not the act of a lone infiltrator. It was the kind of target chosen only after control had already been established, deep, deliberate, and symbolic. Combined with the night's chaos, the conclusion hardened quickly. A Canadian brigade had penetrated the city under cover of darkness. German command did not know was that no Canadian units had crossed the line. No assault force had been approved. In fact, Canadian artillery was still scheduled to open fire at 6:30 that morning. If resistance remained, the city would be shelled street by street, block by block, regardless of the civilians trapped inside. The evacuation order was issued before dawn, not because the Germans had been defeated, but because they believed they already were. They were responding to an enemy they could not locate, could not count, and could not stop. As the last vehicles pulled away and the sun began to rise, the city was empty of German troops. Later would the truth emerge. There had been no brigade moving through the streets, no coordinated assault plan, no supporting fire. There had been one man, operating alone, who understood that if the illusion broke even once, tens of thousands of civilians would pay the price. 6 months earlier, no one believed this man should still be fighting at all. In June 1944, during a reconnaissance patrol in Normandy, a white phosphorus grenade detonated just inches from his face. The blast did not merely wound him, it burned into flesh and bone, searing the left side of his face and destroying most of the vision in his left eye. He was evacuated immediately, classified as unfit for frontline service, and placed under medical review. Doctors were direct. Reconnaissance scouts depended on depth perception, peripheral vision, and rapid visual assessment. Losing one eye was not an inconvenience, it was a career-ending disability. The recommendation was reassignment to training duties or full medical discharge. For most soldiers, it would have been the end of the war. Survival itself would have been considered a victory. He did not accept the verdict. He argued calmly, almost mechanically. When aiming a weapon, one eye is closed anyway. A scope requires focus, not symmetry. He could still shoot. He could still move. He could still think. The doctors refused. Regulations were regulations. He returned to duty anyway. Refusal was not fueled by bravado or defiance for its own sake. It came from a lifetime of being underestimated, raised in poverty, dismissed early by family, shaped by physical labor rather than privilege. He had learned that institutions were slow to change their judgments, but results spoke faster than words. He did not ask for belief. He intended to force it. With his regiment, now wearing an eye patch, he became something German forces struggled to categorize. He operated behind enemy lines alone, not through brute force but through precision and manipulation. He exploited darkness, distance, and fear. He fired from one position, then another, creating the illusion of numbers. He shouted commands in English, threw grenades from unexpected angles, and let confusion do the killing for him. Entire enemy outposts surrendered to a single voice in the dark. the autumn of 1944, he had captured dozens of German soldiers alone, marching them back through contested ground and returning immediately to repeat the process. Officers questioned his methods. Enemy units learned to fear the spaces between gunshots more than the gunfire itself. In April 1945, he was no longer simply a scout. He was a problem one the enemy could never quite solve. And when he volunteered for a night reconnaissance mission into a city filled with civilians and scheduled for artillery bombardment at dawn, he understood something his commanders did not yet grasp. The mission would not be about gathering information. Whether a city lived or burned, the mission orders were clear, limited, and cautious. Enter the city under cover of darkness. Observe enemy strength. Identify defensive positions. Make contact with local resistance if possible. Then, return before dawn. If no report arrived by 6, Canadian artillery would begin firing at 6:30. It was a standard calculation of war. Intelligence weighed against civilian risk, time measured in shells and minutes. Volunteered. One was the one-eyed scout. The other was his closest friend, a corporal who had fought beside him across multiple campaigns and trusted his instincts more than written orders. They crossed no man's land shortly after midnight, moving through fields and shadows the way seasoned scouts always did, low, quiet, patient. Never reached the city. Machine gun position opened fire without warning. The ambush was precise. The corporal was hit repeatedly and killed instantly. The scout returned fire, neutralized the gunner, and crawled to his friend's body in the dark. The mission, by doctrine, was over. Loss of a partner meant immediate withdrawal. No report, no heroics, survival first. Situation no longer fit doctrine. 50,000 civilians. At dawn, artillery would fall whether Germans were present or not. He understood exactly what would happen if he turned back. Streets filled with families would become target grids. Hospitals, homes, churches. None would matter once the guns opened. He stood there with two options: obey procedure and save himself, or violate every rule and attempt something no army trained for, convincing an entire garrison to abandon a city without ever seeing the force they feared. He picked up his friend's weapon. He took his grenades, and he walked into the city alone. Followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was controlled deception. He fired short bursts from elevated positions, then moved quickly, reappearing blocks away. He threw grenades where they would echo, not where they would kill. He allowed German patrols to hear him without ever fixing his position. Each sound suggested coordination. Each movement implied numbers. Officers, already exhausted and isolated late in a collapsing war, interpreted the night exactly as he intended. Prisoners were taken and released with messages. Fires were set not for destruction, but for visibility. The city did not feel infiltrated. It felt occupied. Time dawn approached, German command believed resistance was pointless. They evacuated to avoid annihilation by a force that did not exist. Canadian troops entered the city at first light. They found no defenders, only civilians emerging in disbelief. The artillery never fired. The city stood intact. Only then did commanders understand what had happened. Not an assault, not a miracle. A decision made alone in the dark to accept personal risk so thousands of strangers would not pay the cost of caution. By the time the truth became clear, the war manuals had no chapter that could explain it. In the hours after the city was secured, disbelief spread faster than celebration. Canadian officers searched for German rear guards, booby traps, hidden strongpoints, anything that would explain the sudden emptiness. There were none. White flags hung from windows. Civilians poured into the streets, not cautiously, but with the stunned relief of people who had expected to die at dawn and instead found themselves alive. Gradually did fragments of the truth surface. Dutch resistance members spoke of gunfire moving endlessly through the night, of explosions that never stayed in one place, of a single shadow slipping across rooftops and alleys. Prisoners taken later told the same story from the other side. Orders shouted in English, grenades detonating behind them, messages carried back to headquarters insisting that Canadian forces were already everywhere. Canadian commanders finally located the scout responsible. There was no dramatic debriefing, no triumphant report. He was exhausted, filthy with soot, his ammunition spent. When asked what had happened, his answer was almost dismissive. The Germans had left. The city was free. Artillery wasn't needed. The official after-action report reflected the same uncertainty. It confirmed the liberation of the city with minimal resistance, but avoided detailing how it had been achieved. Even in victory, the idea that one man could manipulate an entire garrison strained credibility. Militaries are built on systems, units, doctrine. Stories that hinge on individual initiative rarely fit cleanly into formal records. The results were impossible to ignore. 50,000 civilians survived the night. Not one shell fell. Not one street was reduced to rubble. The outcome was undeniable. Even if the method made people uncomfortable, it exposed an unsettling truth. Sometimes the most effective action on a battlefield is not firepower, but understanding how fear moves faster than bullets. Recognition came slowly. Medals were awarded, citations written, but the man himself showed little interest in ceremony. He had never acted for applause, and he did not begin seeking it now. When the war ended, he returned home quietly, carrying a story that sounded exaggerated even when told accurately. Years later, the city he liberated remembered more clearly than his own country. Streets were named, monuments raised, anniversaries observed. For the people who had slept through the night expecting death at dawn, the details mattered less than the fact that someone had chosen them over protocol. And his actions forced a question that no doctrine could fully answer. How many rules exist to manage risk, and how many exist simply because no one expects one person to carry that risk alone? Night proved that sometimes history turns not on orders given, but on one individual deciding that obedience is not always the same thing as responsibility. The meaning of that night only became clear with distance. It was not simply a story about bravery or marksmanship or an unlikely tactical success. It was about what happens when a system built on averages encounters an individual who refuses to behave like one. Military doctrine exists to prevent disaster, to reduce chaos, to ensure that most decisions lead to survivable outcomes. But doctrine cannot anticipate the rare moment when following the rules guarantees harm, and breaking them offers a chance at mercy. The decision made in the dark, not to win a fight, but to prevent one, not to destroy an enemy, but to convince him that destruction was inevitable elsewhere. The entire operation rested on a single fragile assumption, that fear, once seated, would outrun verification. If German command hesitated, if one officer demanded proof, if one patrol moved decisively instead of retreating, the illusion would collapse. The consequences would have been immediate and fatal. Nothing in that outcome was guaranteed. It worked because the man executing it understood something beyond tactics. He understood exhaustion. He understood the psychology of an army already losing a war. He understood that by April 1945, German units were primed to believe the worst, to expect encirclement, to assume betrayal by circumstance itself. He did not create panic out of nothing. He aligned his actions with what the enemy already feared was coming. In the war, history struggled to place him. He did not fit comfortably into national mythology. He was not an officer, not a strategist, not a symbol polished for speeches. He was a soldier who acted when there was no one left to ask permission. His greatest achievement saved tens of thousands of lives and left almost no physical evidence behind. No battlefield ruins, no mass grave, just an absence of destruction where destruction had been scheduled. Absence is easy to overlook. History remembers explosions more clearly than silences. It catalogs cities that burned more readily than cities that did not. For decades, his story lived mostly in the memory of the people who were still alive because of it, and in the quiet respect of soldiers who understood exactly how thin the margin had been. And his legacy was not about one eye, or one weapon, or one city. It was about the refusal to accept that outcomes are fixed simply because procedures say they are. It was proof that being underestimated is not just a disadvantage, it can be leverage. And on one night near the end of a brutal war, that leverage spared an entire city while the guns stayed silent. That's why the story endures. Not because it was spectacular, but because it revealed something unsettling and hopeful at the same time. That even in systems designed to crush individuality, a single decision made alone under pressure, with no guarantee of survival, can quietly change the fate of thousands. The lesson of this story does not sit comfortably inside traditional ideas of heroism. It is not a lesson about charging forward under fire, overpowering an enemy, or sacrificing oneself in a blaze of visible glory. Instead, it is a quieter, more unsettling lesson about judgment, responsibility, and the difference between following rules and understanding consequences. What happened that night forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Systems are designed to manage probability, not morality, and sometimes the most ethical choice exists outside the boundaries those systems define. Military doctrine exists for good reasons. It reduces chaos, limits unnecessary loss, and gives structure to environments where fear and confusion can otherwise dominate. Procedures are written in blood, shaped by disasters where improvisation failed and discipline broke down. The rule to abort a mission when a partner is killed is not cowardice. It is survival logic refined over decades. Most of the time, obeying it saves lives. But doctrine assumes that the cost of withdrawal is lower than the cost of continuation. On that night, it was not. Withdrawal would have shifted the burden of risk away from one soldier and onto tens of thousands of civilians. The doctrine functioned exactly as designed, but the situation it was applied to fell outside the moral frame it was built for. The first lesson, then, is that responsibility does not always align with authority. Authority says what is permitted. Responsibility asks who will pay if nothing is done. The man at the center of this story did not have the authority to alter the course of the battle, cancel an artillery strike, or redefine the mission. He did not possess the rank, the radio, or the formal mandate to make decisions affecting a city. Yet, he had something far more dangerous: awareness. He understood the timing, the consequences, and the irreversible nature of what was coming. Once you understand that, inaction becomes a choice rather than a default. Responsibility begins the moment you realize that obeying orders will predictably cause harm you could plausibly prevent. The other lesson lies in how power actually functions under stress. We often imagine power as something that flows from numbers, weapons, or hierarchy. But in reality, power frequently flows from perception. The German garrison did not retreat because it had been defeated in combat. It retreated because it believed defeat was inevitable. The physical balance of force never changed. What changed was the narrative inside the enemy's decision-making loop. This reveals a deeper truth about conflict, whether military, political, or social. People rarely act on perfect information. They act on what they believe others believe. Fear multiplies faster than facts, and confidence, real or performed, can reshape outcomes without ever engaging in direct confrontation. It's not a romantic insight. It is a dangerous one. Psychological dominance can save lives, but it can also enable manipulation, coercion, and abuse. The difference lies in intent and consequence. In this case, the intent was not domination for its own sake, but the prevention of mass civilian death. The consequence was the absence of destruction. That distinction matters. Power without ethical constraint is exploitation. Power wielded to reduce harm, even at personal risk, occupies a different moral category. The story teaches that understanding how fear works is morally neutral. How you choose to apply that understanding is not. It's also a lesson about risk distribution. Modern systems are built to spread risk evenly across units, procedures, and contingencies. This is efficient and fair most of the time. What happened that night was the opposite. Risk was concentrated deliberately into a single person. Instead of thousands of civilians absorbing the risk of artillery fire, one individual absorbed the risk of detection, capture, or death. This inversion is uncomfortable precisely because it violates how institutions prefer risk to behave. Institutions exist to avoid dependence on exceptional individuals. Yet history repeatedly shows moments where progress, survival, or mercy occurs because someone chooses to bear a burden that was meant to be shared. Leads to a harder lesson. Exceptional outcomes often depend on exceptional willingness to accept consequences. There was no guarantee of success. If the deception failed, the result would not have been a heroic last stand. It would have been a meaningless death, followed by the very bombardment he sought to prevent. The story reminds us that meaningful action is often indistinguishable from recklessness until it succeeds. We praise courage after the fact, but in the moment, courage looks identical to disobedience, insubordination, or madness. This creates a moral paradox for institutions. They rely on discipline to function, yet occasionally benefit from individuals who break discipline for reasons that only make sense in hindsight. Another lesson emerges from the way the story was recorded, or rather, not fully recorded. Official reports minimize the role of individual action, not out of malice, but because the event did not fit the language of institutional memory. Systems are good at documenting what they can replicate. They struggle to document what they cannot. A tactic that cannot be taught, standardized, or safely repeated becomes an anomaly rather than a model. As a result, some of the most consequential human decisions vanish into footnotes, oral histories, or local memory. This reminds us that history, as we receive it, is shaped not only by what happened, but by what could be comfortably explained. The gap between lived reality and recorded history carries its own lesson. If we rely solely on official narratives, we risk misunderstanding how change actually occurs. We learn about battles, not about nights where battles were avoided. We study destruction, not restraint. This shapes cultural expectations, especially around heroism. We come to associate value with visible impact ruins, casualties, decisive clashes rather than with absences. Cities that still stand, people who never became victims, catastrophes that never happened. The story challenges us to recalibrate what we consider meaningful outcomes. There's also a lesson about being underestimated. From the beginning, the central figure of this story lived under diminished expectations by family, by institutions, by medical authorities, by doctrine itself. Being underestimated did not simply frustrate him. It created operational space. The enemy did not imagine that one wounded scout could pose a strategic threat. His own command did not imagine that a reconnaissance patrol could prevent an artillery strike without ever reporting back. Underestimation created freedom of action. This does not mean that marginalization is desirable or fair, but it does reveal a tactical reality. Assumptions are vulnerabilities. Those who are dismissed often move unseen, and in certain contexts, invisibility is a form of advantage. This advantage comes at a cost. When outcomes depend on being underestimated, recognition often comes late or not at all. The burden of proof shifts unfairly onto the individual. Success becomes the only acceptable argument, and failure would have confirmed every prejudice. This is a brutal standard to live under. The lesson here is not that institutions should rely on such individuals, but that institutions should examine why they repeatedly fail to recognize competence that does not fit expected profiles. Talent constrained by bias is not just unjust, it is inefficient. Another important lesson concerns moral agency under uncertainty. The decision to continue alone into the city was not made with full information. The strength of the garrison was unknown. The reaction of German command was unpredictable. The response of civilians was uncertain. Moral clarity did not come from certainty of success, but from clarity of consequence. This distinction matters deeply. Ethical action does not require knowing the outcome. It requires understanding the stakes. When one option predictably causes harm and another carries risk without certainty, choosing the risky option can be morally defensible even if it fails. The lesson here is that morality is not outcome-based alone. It is intention-informed and consequence-aware. The story also speaks to the psychology of exhaustion. By April 1945, German forces were not simply losing militarily, they were collapsing psychologically. Years of attrition, retreat, and disintegration had primed them to interpret ambiguity as disaster. The success of the deception depended on reading that context accurately. This teaches a broader lesson about timing. Actions that would fail in one moment can succeed in another because human systems have emotional states. Understanding when a system is brittle is as important as understanding its formal structure. This applies beyond warfare to organizations, economies, and societies under strain. A further lesson about restraint. Despite having weapons and opportunities, the goal was never maximum lethality. Shots were fired to be heard, not to rack up casualties. Grenades were used to create noise and fire, not mass death. Prisoners were released rather than held or killed. Even the destruction of the Gestapo headquarters carried symbolic weight beyond tactical necessity. This restraint was not softness, it was precision. It demonstrates that effectiveness does not always correlate with violence. In some situations, minimizing harm requires discipline more demanding than aggression. It leads to a lesson about courage that is rarely discussed. Courage is often portrayed as the willingness to face death. But there is another kind of courage, the willingness to act without recognition, to take responsibility without permission, and to accept blame if things go wrong. Had the plan failed, there would have been no defense, no order to point to, no superior to blame. The entire moral and practical weight of the decision rested on one person. That is a form of courage that does not lend itself to slogans or medals, because it is defined by accountability rather than sacrifice alone. The aftermath of the story reveals another truth. Recognition came unevenly and late. The city remembered immediately because it lived the consequence. The nation took longer because the story challenged comfortable narratives. This teaches that gratitude and acknowledgement often correlate more with proximity than with scale. Those directly affected understand the value of what was prevented. Distant observers require explanation, documentation, and time. The lesson here is not bitterness, but realism. Meaningful action does not guarantee recognition, and expecting recognition can corrupt decision-making in moments where clarity matters most. Perhaps the deepest lesson of all is about silence. The most important outcome of that night was what did not happen. No artillery barrage. No mass graves. No ruined city center. Silence, in this case, was the sound of survival. But silence is hard to commemorate. It does not photograph well. It does not dominate textbooks. This creates a bias in how societies remember their past. We glorify destruction because it leaves evidence. We overlook prevention because it leaves none. The story asks us to reconsider what we choose to remember and why. The story teaches something about human agency in systems designed to limit it. Modern institutions are built to reduce reliance on individuals because individuals are unpredictable. This is sensible, but systems can never fully eliminate the need for judgment. There will always be moments where information outruns permission, where consequences outrun procedure. In those moments, someone must decide whether to be a functionary or an agent. The lesson is not that everyone should act alone, but that systems should acknowledge the moral weight placed on individuals when they reach the edge of protocol. The night that saved a city was not a triumph of chaos over order. It was a reminder that order exists to serve human life, not the other way around. When rules begin to guarantee harm, Breaking them can become the most disciplined act of all. This is not a lesson that can be easily taught or safely replicated. It resists simplification, but it endures because it captures something essential about responsibility, that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone, accepting uncertainty, and choosing to carry a burden that no one officially asked you to carry. This is why this story matters beyond its historical context. It speaks to every situation where procedure collides with conscience, where safety for one group demands risk from another, where silence can be more powerful than force. It reminds us that history does not only turn on orders issued from command posts, but on decisions made quietly by individuals who understand that inaction is also a choice and that sometimes it is the most dangerous one of all. The continuation of this lesson begins where the first one ends, with the recognition that what saved the city was not a miracle, not luck, and not a superhuman act, but a convergence of human judgment, psychological insight, and moral courage operating under extreme pressure. To understand why this matters beyond one night in one war, we have to examine what this story reveals about how humans actually navigate responsibility when systems fail to account for reality. The most striking elements of this story is how invisible the decisive moment truly was. There was no dramatic announcement, no turning point marked by an explosion or a command broadcast over the radio. The most important moment occurred in silence, standing beside a fallen friend in the dark, weighing two futures that could not be reconciled. In one future, doctrine was followed, survival prioritized, and a city was destroyed by scheduled artillery fire. In the other, doctrine was violated, personal survival placed in doubt, and civilians given a chance to live. The lesson here is that the most consequential decisions in human history often happen far away from cameras, records, and witnesses. They happen when no one is watching, and when the outcome cannot be justified afterward if it fails. Uncomfortable because it undermines the way modern societies prefer to think about accountability. We like decisions to be traceable, documented, approved. We like responsibility to flow upward through clear hierarchies. But reality does not always cooperate. In fast-moving, high-stakes situations, the person with the clearest understanding of consequences is often the one with the least formal authority. This creates a moral bottleneck. Either that person acts beyond their mandate, or no one acts at all. The lesson is not that hierarchy is wrong, but that hierarchy alone cannot carry moral weight in every situation. Sometimes responsibility accumulates at the lowest level simply because that is where reality is most visible. A critical lesson emerges when we consider how fear behaves inside organizations. The German garrison did not flee because it was outgunned. It fled because uncertainty compounded faster than verification. Each report reinforced the next. Each explosion made the previous one seem more credible. This cascade illustrates a fundamental property of human systems under stress. They tend to default to worst-case interpretations when ambiguity is high and trust is low. This is not unique to wartime. Corporations collapse over rumors. Governments overreact to incomplete intelligence. Markets panic on perception rather than fact. The same mechanism that saved a city that night can, under different intentions, cause catastrophic overreaction. Understanding this mechanism carries ethical responsibility. The ability to manipulate perception is powerful precisely because it bypasses rational evaluation. That power must be constrained by intent and outcome. In this story, perception was manipulated to prevent violence, not to enable it. That distinction matters deeply. The lesson here is not that deception is good, but that influence over perception is inevitable in human systems, and pretending otherwise only ensures it will be wielded irresponsibly by those with fewer ethical constraints. Also a lesson about time pressure and moral clarity. The artillery schedule created a fixed horizon. At 6:30, shells would fall regardless of what anyone felt or believed. That deadline stripped the situation of philosophical ambiguity. It forced a binary choice. In many moral dilemmas, uncertainty allows for delay, debate, and diffusion of responsibility. Here, delay was itself a decision. The lesson is that urgency clarifies ethics. When time collapses options, moral responsibility becomes sharper, not blurrier. Waiting becomes an act, not a neutral state. Implications far beyond warfare. In crises, natural disasters, industrial failures, public health emergencies, the same dynamic appears. Systems often hesitate, waiting for confirmation, authorization, or consensus, while harm accelerates. Individuals closest to the problem see what is coming, but lack permission to intervene. The story suggests that moral courage is not only about bold action, but about recognizing when waiting is indistinguishable from choosing harm. This is a difficult lesson because it challenges the comfort of procedural innocence. Another layer of the story's lesson lies in how the individual understood the enemy not as an abstract force, but as humans operating under psychological strain. He did not imagine German soldiers as faceless opponents. He understood their exhaustion, their fear, their expectations near the end of a collapsing war. He knew they wanted an excuse to leave. This empathy toward the enemy, not just towards civilians, is often misunderstood. It does not mean sympathy or forgiveness. It means accurate modeling of human behavior. The lesson is that understanding your adversary as human does not weaken you. It allows you to predict actions more precisely than dehumanization ever could. Insight challenges a common myth about conflict, that moral clarity requires moral simplification. In reality, effective moral action often depends on complexity. Seeing all parties as human does not blur right and wrong. It sharpens cause and effect. In this case, recognizing the enemy's fear allowed for a solution that avoided unnecessary killing on both sides. That is not moral compromise, it is moral efficiency. The story also forces us to confront how institutions respond to actions they cannot comfortably replicate. The official record acknowledged the outcome, but softened the cause. This was not necessarily deliberate erasure, it was structural discomfort. Institutions depend on predictability. An action that relies on individual intuition, risk tolerance, and psychological insight cannot be standardized without losing what made it work. As a result, such actions are often treated as anomalies rather than lessons. The danger here is subtle but profound. When institutions ignore these anomalies, they also ignore the conditions that made them necessary. This leads to a broader lesson about learning. Systems tend to learn from failures more readily than from avoided catastrophes. A failed operation produces reports, reforms, and revisions. A disaster prevented produces silence. No ruins demand explanation. No casualties demand accountability. As a result, prevention remains undervalued. The lesson is that absence of harm should be treated as data, not as a lack of evidence. Otherwise, societies will continue to reward reaction over foresight. Another important theme is the relationship between identity and opportunity. The individual at the center of this story was repeatedly underestimated due to background, language, injury, and rank. These limitations, imposed by others, paradoxically gave him freedom. He was not burdened with expectations of command. He was not watched closely. He was not considered strategically significant. This invisibility allowed him to operate outside assumptions. The lesson is double-edged. Marginalization is unjust and costly, but it also reveals how rigid systems overlook unconventional competence. This should not romanticize exclusion, but it should prompt serious reflection on how many potential problem solvers are ignored because they do not match institutional templates. Also a lesson about resilience that goes beyond physical endurance. Losing vision in one eye was not just a physical injury, it was a symbolic one. It represented the system's verdict that he was no longer whole, no longer reliable, no longer fit for responsibility. His refusal to accept that verdict was not denial of reality, but redefinition of capability. He did not insist he was unchanged. He insisted he was still sufficient. This distinction matters. Resilience is not pretending damage does not exist. It is deciding that damage does not nullify agency. Implications for how societies treat injury, disability, and limitation. Too often, systems focus on deficits rather than remaining capacity. They ask what someone can no longer do, rather than what they can still do well. The lesson here is that competence is contextual. In the right context, perceived limitations may be irrelevant. In some cases, they may even sharpen focus. This does not argue against safety standards, but it argues for flexibility and individualized judgment rather than blanket exclusion. The lesson emerges from the way personal grief intersected with moral resolve. The death of his friend could have justified withdrawal, rage, or collapse. Instead, it intensified purpose. This is not a lesson that grief should be instrumentalized, or that trauma inherently produces strength. That would be false and dangerous. Rather, the lesson is that meaning can coexist with pain. The decision to continue was not made despite grief, but through it. This complicates simplistic narratives about emotional detachment being necessary for effective action. In reality, emotion often provides the clarity that pure calculation lacks. The story also highlights the difference between bravery and responsibility. Bravery seeks danger. Responsibility accepts danger when it cannot be avoided without causing greater harm. What happened that night was not a quest for glory. It was an acceptance of burden. This distinction matters because societies often celebrate bravery while neglecting responsibility. Bravery looks impressive. Responsibility often looks quiet, heavy, and uncelebrated. Yet it is responsibility that sustains ethical action over time. Years passed, recognition arrived unevenly. The city remembered because it lived the consequence. The nation remembered later, and partially. This disparity teaches a lesson about proximity and gratitude. Those closest to harm understand prevention most clearly. Those farther away require narrative, context, and repetition. This is not a moral failure so much as a human one, but it suggests that societies should listen more carefully to local memory, to lived experience, rather than relying solely on centralized narratives. The story's endurance also reveals something about how meaning evolves over time. At the moment of action, the individual was not thinking about legacy, symbolism, or lessons. He was thinking about dawn and artillery schedules. Meaning was assigned later by those who survived and those who studied the event. This reminds us that moral action does not require philosophical framing in advance. It requires clarity of consequence. Meaning is often a byproduct, not a prerequisite. The lesson lies in how this story challenges the binary between individual and collective action. It is tempting to frame the event as proof that individuals matter more than systems. That would be a mistake. The story only makes sense because a system existed. Artillery schedules, reconnaissance doctrine, garrison structures, psychological expectations. The individual exploited the system's assumptions. Without the system, the action would have been meaningless. The lesson is not individualism over collectivism, but interaction. Systems shape individuals, and individuals sometimes reshape outcomes within systems. Interaction raises an uncomfortable question. How should systems prepare for morally necessary disobedience? Encouraging rule-breaking is dangerous, but discouraging moral judgment is worse. The lesson is not that systems should create loopholes, but that they should cultivate ethical reasoning at every level. People should understand not just what rules exist, but why they exist and what harms they are meant to prevent. When that understanding is widespread, fewer people will face impossible choices alone. The final and perhaps most enduring lesson is about silence as an ethical outcome. The city that did not burn, the civilians who did not die, the battle that did not happen, these are absences that rarely define history. Yet they represent one of the highest forms of success. The story teaches us to value prevention, restraint, and quiet outcomes in a world obsessed with spectacle. It asks us to reconsider what we praise, what we record, and what we teach. And this continuation of the lesson brings us back to the same place. Responsibility is not always assigned. Sometimes it is discovered. It appears when someone understands the full weight of consequences and realizes that no one else is positioned to act. In those moments, the choice is not between heroism and safety, but between accepting a burden or letting it fall on the innocent. This is why this story continues to matter. Not because it offers a formula, but because it offers a mirror. It reflects the reality that in every complex system, there will be moments when procedure ends and judgment begins. When those moments come, history will not remember the rules that were followed, but the lives that were saved or lost because someone chose to act. That is the final lesson carried forward from that night, that moral courage is not about certainty, recognition, or success. It is about choosing to carry responsibility when doing nothing would be easier, safer, and fully permitted, yet wrong.